Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the Future of Retail in a Post-Pandemic World, Ask Me Anything Live. My name is Reilly Stevens. I am the Director of Insights here at Retail Profit, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's discussion. First of all, I'd like to say we were absolutely blown away by how many of you have chosen to join us today from your home offices or from your beds, wherever you're tuning in from. This is a judgment-free zone, so feel free to just sit back and relax and enjoy the next hour that we spend together. Because there are so many of us here today, I just wanted to go through a few housekeeping items before we jump into the discussion, just to keep us on track for the next hour. So, as I mentioned, we've allocated an hour for this chat. And in an effort to be respectful of everyone's time, we're going to be strictly adhering to that today. So we'll be moving things along. And as a result, we're not going to get to everyone's questions. So you'll notice today that for the chat box has actually been disabled. We're going to be accepting all of your questions through the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom of your screen there. You can submit a question through the Q&A box, but just note that if you submit a second time, we're going to be actually removing those questions from the queue in an effort to get everyone's questions, or as many questions as we can, throughout the next hour. We're going to be doing a live stream on YouTube Live as well. So if you're joining us from YouTube, welcome. Just note that you won't be able to submit a question through the YouTube live stream. We're not going to be checking that chat. We'll only be accepting questions through Zoom. But with that being said, if you do have a question and you're joining us from a different platform, you can use the hashtag RetailProfitAMA, and we're going to be following up this chat on Twitter and social media to answer as many questions as we can through those platforms as well. We encourage you, of course, to post and share your thoughts, your feelings, your comments on today's discussion as much as you'd like. Now, that's enough from me. I'm going to quickly throw this over to Doug. Doug Stevens is the founder of Retail Profit, and I'm assuming that most people that are joining us for today's discussion are at least slightly familiar with Doug. But if you're not, I encourage you to check out the Retail Profit website where you can get more information about Doug, myself, and the company. Doug is currently in the midst of writing his third and highly anticipated book, Resurrecting Retail, The Future of Business in a Post-Pandemic World, coming early spring 2021. Now, the insights that Doug is going to be sharing with us today are based on the extensive research that he has done to date for the book. Pass it over to you, Doug. Take it away.
Hey, thanks, Reilly, and thanks everyone for joining. It's nice to be together with 460 of our closest friends this morning. So thank you very much from wherever you're joining in. Yeah, as Reilly said, I was planning to write a book that was going to be released early spring 2021. And I was working on that book. And it was really sort of a philosophical look at the intersection of art and retail, and trying to sort of take some of the concepts that we had been discussing for years to the next level to help retailers get to that next level. And I guess it was around March 3rd that I was watching the news one day, and it was just sort of this confluence of things that I saw. There was, I think, a really significant spike in cases in Italy. There was a rumbling in the stock market taking place. There were implications on the ground in China for another flare-up, just a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And I remember distinctly thinking that I'm writing the wrong book here. And so the following morning, I got on the phone to my publisher and I just said, you know, I really feel that this is going to be probably the biggest event in our lifetime, certainly the biggest event in the retail industry. And so, to my mind, this is the only story that we should be writing about. That, you know, we're in a time now where there's this tremendous consumer uncertainty. There's fear, there's panic around the health concern. We're seeing potential bankruptcies among legacy retailers, closings of small independent retailers. And so, I'm fortunate in the sense that I have a really understanding publisher. And no questions asked. They just said, go, write that story. So that's what I've been sort of embroiled in for the last couple of months, is really digging into this and trying to understand not just the present, but the future. Where does this lead us? And so along the way, we've been getting all kinds of questions from followers, from clients. And so we thought it would be a good idea to just reach out to all of you and to just share whatever we can today. You know, this is this is sort of a changing animal. It changes every day, and we're learning new things about it. But we're just here to really share what we know so far, and hopefully give you a little bit of a sense of direction. So that's sort of it. So enough of that. Let's get on with it. Let's get to our first question, Ryan.
Sure thing. So before we jump into the questions, which we are already getting questions through the Q&A, so thank you, keep them coming. I have a couple questions myself just to set the stage for today's conversation. You know, we mentioned, or I've heard a lot of other people talking about, what can we compare this to? What other events have happened that we can draw from to understand what the best course of action is moving forward? So my question is there anything in recent history that we can compare this crisis to in terms of scale and scope, or really anything that we can use to understand the short-term future and what that might look like?
Yeah, it's a great question, that sort of level setting of the environment. The fact of the matter is, our problem right now is not that we don't have anything to compare this to. The problem is we have too many things to compare this to. There are qualities of this crisis that we find ourselves in that share qualities with other crises. So, you know, there's the sort of the traumatic effect that we saw during 9/11, because let's face it, although this wasn't quite as a short-term catastrophic event, we're dealing with massive losses of life. In fact, we're suffering in the US alone a 9/11, so to speak, every day. So there's that aspect to it. There's also certainly the economic fallout from this, which we could point to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. We believe that at this point it might even be more protracted, so we can go back and we can look at elements of the Depression in this as well. We've seen sort of the commandeering of manufacturing resources by governments around the world, and that shares qualities with World War II, you know, something that we haven't seen a government do since that time. And then, of course, we can go all the way back to 1918 and look at the 1918 pandemic and how that worked out. But the problem with all of those comparisons is there's one thing missing from really all of them, including the financial crisis, and that is that we live today with a very, very robust online ability. And an internet that now has the capacity to bridge some of those gaps. So it's a difficult sort of Rubik's Cube to try and put together, but there's lots of reference points, and we have to sort of distill the learnings from each of those in order to put together a picture. What we do know at this time, let's be honest about this, this is probably the largest health crisis of our lives, and it has the potential to be one of the deepest and longest financial crises of our times as well.
So there are those who maintain that retail will bounce back sharply once this is all over. What are your thoughts on that?
So if this were just a matter of COVID-19, if it was just, if this were a short-term health crisis that had a clear sort of end date where we could know for certain that we'll be out of the woods by a certain time, I would suggest that, yeah, perhaps there will be that sort of return to the way things were. The problem is that this is there's a dual sort of threat here. We have the health crisis, which right now we know could potentially last as long as 12 to 18 months, and that's being optimistic. You know, I mean, the vaccine for HIV is still being sought 26 years later. So there's no guarantee around when a vaccine will come. And until we have a vaccine, there really cannot be any full return to supply in the retail industry. We just won't get to a level where we're kind of at pre-pandemic levels of supply in the retail industry. But then the other complex problem here is that the longer this crisis drags on from a health standpoint, the greater the toll it takes on the economy, the greater the losses will be in jobs. Job insecurity will be significant. The markets are taking a beating, so that's going to sort of put high net worth consumers on the sidelines. You know, so there are all of these various implications, not to mention just sheer consumer reluctance to get back to retail, that I don't think we're going to see a full bounce back. Now, that's just my opinion, but let's look at what's happening on the ground. So let's look at China. And we understand that China locked down in a way that really no other country has, or frankly could, because of the level of authority that the government has in China. But they locked down completely, and they're still seeing flare-ups. They're still seeing consumers not just worried about the health concerns, but also worried about the economy. 50% of Chinese consumers say they're sidelined. They're going to be saving their money and not going out to retail in a big way. Now, let's look at Germany to try and get sort of a Western economy point of view. When German stores opened up, and this is anecdotal, I was talking to people who were on the ground in Germany and sort of seeing this with their own eyes. They said volumes look like they're about 30 or 40% of what they were. That's not a bounce back. And as we know, many retailers, even if they have a decent online game, they're not able to bridge the deficit in sales with their online sales. So we're going to see, I think, a really slow, incremental, protracted return. But until there's a vaccine here, there's no bounce back.
So on that, I want to throw this to our participants here. I've got a quick poll that I'd love if everyone could contribute. I'm going to launch the poll. I'll give you about 30 seconds to answer. The question here is, when stores reopen in your city, will you be reluctant to visit them? And while you answer that, Doug, I have a quick follow-up question, which is, you're saying here that retailers will have to maintain for up to 18 months on a fraction of normal revenue, only to emerge in a potential recession. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the thinking. And it all really revolves around job insecurity. I mean, the fact of the matter is, we've seen more people laid off in a single week in the US, for example, than we saw through the entire duration of the financial crisis. So, I mean, that's the level of job loss and job insecurity that we're dealing with. And I think that that's going to be pervasive. And even when retailers are able to go through a reopening and begin the process of opening, how many of us really believe that retailers are going to go out and they're going to hire back exactly the same number of people that they let go? I think retailers are certainly going to be hedging against the future by really trying to manage those payrolls. So if we're dealing with a situation where we have persistently high unemployment, and I'm talking here potentially double-digit unemployment, that's going to be a massive drag on the retail economy. And no, we're not going to see a full bounce back to normal until those conditions alleviate themselves.
Okay, so I'll share the results from that poll. 41% here said that they would be somewhat reluctant, which sort of echoes the sentiment that you were describing earlier in terms of the feelings towards returning to stores once they reopen. So that's very interesting. Now, I've got a question that's actually come up several times now through the chat. This question comes to us from Aaron, Todd, and a few anonymous attendees as well. This question is centered around the online retail changing and then in turn, physical retail changing. Some of the questions are, is this the end of brick and mortar as we know it? And you've spoken a lot about this in past books that you've written. So take us through the shift between online and physical retail and what that looks like in the short term and long term.
Yeah, sure. So, a lot of what we have talked about in the past, and certainly I talked about at length in my last book, Reengineering Retail, was this idea that there was a bit of a trading of places going on between online and brick and mortar. That we've sort of looked at these two forces and sort of said, no, they're not competing. It's just omni-channel. It's all one big channel, and the consumer can bounce back and forth between channels. We'll serve them wherever they are. My position was that there was something a little bit more complex, a little deeper undercurrent going on, and that was that there was really a trading of roles. That online, in many ways now, is the store. I mean, let's face it, when we think about buying something, our first instinct is not to jump in the car and go to a shopping center or to a department store, much less. Our first instinct is to go online and see where that product is. And now in an increasing percentage of cases, we're not just going online, then going to the store, we're just buying what we need online. So that that my belief was that online is becoming the store. So the question was, well, what's the point of having a physical store? And my belief is that physical stores were actually becoming a really powerful media channel, that physical stores were a means of customer acquisition. We could bring consumers into the ecosystem through physical stores, and then we could enjoy a lifetime customer value through all of the various online channels that we offer them. I still believe that that's the case. And in fact, I think that what we've seen over the last 3 months is that indeed online is the store. And for many of us, it's the only store that we are using right now. So I think going forward, we're going to see two streams of investment. We're going to see a whole shitload of retailers now trying to get up to speed because they've realized that they've been caught here. You know, COVID-19 goes after pre-existing conditions, and the retail industry had a lot of pre-existing conditions, namely too much of a reliance on physical stores. So we're going to see in the aftermath of this, and it's already starting to happen, we're going to see retailers really trying to build up their online capabilities. The problem with that, though, is they're going to be using companies like Amazon, Alibaba, JD.com as the benchmark. They're going to be looking at that as the high watermark. If we can just get to that point, we'll be good. The problem is that's not going to be the case, because I believe that Amazon is already going to be making investments in the next level of the online experience. And I'll tell you why I say that. About 2 years ago, a young lady named Nia Singh from New York got in touch with me. And Nia said she was working on building out a platform that would change the online shopping experience entirely. What she did was she built CGI stores, virtual stores. She was working with brands on test projects like Gucci and that sort of thing. So anyway, we began talking, and she said, you know, I'd love it if you could make some introductions, just let people know about what we're doing, give us any advice. So I looked at her demos. I thought they were really good. I totally agreed that we need to take the online experience to the next level, make online stores more like physical stores. All that was good. I just felt that her demos might need a little bit more refinement, a little bit more work. So I said, you know what, work on it. Call me in 6 months and let's do this. Well, in the meantime, Amazon invested many millions of dollars in Nia's business. They became a major backer of her business called Obsess. You can look it up online. It's a great concept. So Amazon became a major backer. So clearly, Bezos and team understand that the online experience we have today sucks. If we're being honest about it, it's not really great. It's not social. It's not interactive. There's nothing sort of entertaining about it. And Obsess is a business that can take that to the next level. So I think we're going to see one part of the market going in one direction to be as good as Amazon, but I think Amazon's going to change the terms of reference entirely over the next 5 years in terms of what an online experience is. In terms of physical stores, I believe more profoundly than I ever have now that the physical store as a means of distribution of products is an outmoded notion. I think it's inefficient. It ties up enormous amounts of capital. The cost on the ground of selling a product to a consumer is extremely high. But with that said, the physical store as a means of reaching out to consumers, forming a relationship, becoming an experiential point is really important. Now, that physical stores are going to be taken out of the equation, obviously, for the most part, for the next 12 to 18 months or until we have a vaccine. But when we get back to a point where we start to see full reopenings, where consumer confidence is back and the health pandemic is over, I think we're going to see a completely different looking physical retail landscape that is much, much more geared towards experiential retail.
Fantastic. We have so many follow-up questions to that. One of them comes from Shannon Ryan, who is our friend from Valtech. And he says, can you give some category examples of retail that will suffer more than others? For example, grocery is going gangbusters, but luxury is struggling. So talk us through the common threads of who's going to succeed in this world, who's going to do potentially more poorly given the circumstances.
Yeah, great question. And thanks for joining, Shannon. It's great to have you. So, I mean, obviously, the obvious stuff is right in front of our nose, right? I mean, who would not want to own a pharmacy chain today? Who would not want to own a grocery chain? So certainly essential services are benefiting. online players like Alibaba, Amazon, and others are just basically clearing the table right now in terms of their growth. Going forward, once we sort of get through the meaningful part, if you will, of the pandemic, once we start to see the light at the end of that tunnel, then I think we're going to start to see some austerity in terms of consumer spending. So I think we're going to see a real retraction on discretionary spending. We'll see increases in non-discretionary. Consumers are really going to hunker down. Again, we're dealing with, I mean, if we look at sort of the constituents that are involved in this, you know, you've got baby boomers who we know that 75% of American baby boomers, for example, are underfunded in terms of their retirement. Well, good luck with that, because their retirement funds just got nailed by about 30%. So they're going to be hunkered down, trying to save money, trying to plan for retirement. We've got millennials now who have taken two financial crises right in the chops. And so the first one impeded their incomes by 14% on average over a protracted period. The next one could take them even a couple of steps further back. You've got Gen X, who's been just waiting in the wings, waiting patiently for baby boomers to finally retire. And they're now looking at potentially a workforce where baby boomers are going to stay in longer. And then, of course, there's Gen Z. And Gen Z will just be entering the workforce at a time when we could be plunged into recession or, God forbid, depression. So I think we're going to see a very sober consumer on the other side of this. I don't necessarily see a wild sort of return to crazy spending anytime soon. And that sort of is reflected in the 1918 pandemic as well. When we look back, in fact, by 1920, the GDP in the US was still increasing, but it was really by 21 when the damage really started to set in, 1921, 22, and it actually took until 1925 to get back to a pre-pandemic level of gross domestic product. So good question. I mean, essential stuff, the stuff we need to survive, the safety and security stuff, we're going to see spending in that regard. Durables, we may see some spending, but it's really going to be the discretionary and luxury spending that's going to take the hit.
So on that, I love this question that comes to us from France. And they ask, I listened to your podcast about freedom becoming luxury. Freedom might be even more essential nowadays for consumers after this crisis. How do you think this trend will influence retailers? So if you could just take us and give us a brief overview of what that podcast about freedom and luxury was, and then maybe just give us some more information about how you believe this trend will evolve post-COVID, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So my thinking at the time, and this goes back to an article that I wrote for the Business of Fashion, where I was sort of positing the idea that, you know, luxury as a concept has always sort of been associated with material possessions, that we as consumers, as we achieved certain milestones in our lives, we very often marked them with the purchase of a luxury good, whether it was a Rolex watch or a Mercedes-Benz or what have you. But I felt that fundamentally millennials could be a different generation, partly because of the circumstances in which they grew up. I mean, they witnessed their parents claw their way up the social and professional ladder to acquire, you know, big homes and cars, only to have a lot of that ripped away from them in the financial crisis. We've seen them have very, very, you know, turbulent time in the job market. They've also dealt with a lot of divorce in their families. So it was a very sort of different climate that millennials grew up in. When you couple that with the fact that social currency today, the ability to tell your friends that you've achieved a certain status, is related less through material possessions today and more through experiences. That it's not about what you own necessarily or what's parked in your garage so much. It's more about where you are, who you're with, and what you're doing. So I felt that, you know, fundamentally, we're going to be dealing with a consumer who may view luxury as the ability to do what they want, the ability to work where they want, the ability to live debt-free, the ability to enjoy the work that they do, and certainly the ability to travel and to have these experiences. I believe that that could become even a more profound trend, because I think that this has given us, if nothing else, this crisis has given us an opportunity to really reflect. In two senses: the ability to reflect on the degree to which we really do need people, that we really do need a social structure around us for our own mental well-being, but also to to reflect on what really are our minimum needs. What is it that we need to survive? Are all these material trappings really necessary? And so, yeah, I think that we could see a little bit of a sobering that takes place after this. But again, these things run in cycles. Will we get back to a point where it's all about, the Gucci handbag? Or, yeah, probably. But we could have a much more sober consumer in the aftermath of this.
Fantastic. Now, our next question comes from Chris Wood, which also ties nicely into a question that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is, what do you see the role of the retail associate being in the future, both inside the store and outside? And really, I think if we take this a little bit more macro, what do you see as the role of people changing in retail? Because I really believe that this affects sort of every level of the supply chain, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, people have really been front and center. I wrote another article for Business of Fashion magazine, and it was around the idea that we're calling people on the front lines of retail heroes, which is great. The only problem is we're not paying them like they're heroes, and we're not treating them like they're heroes the other 300 days of the year. So will the role of humans in the retail world change? I think it will. I think that we could, in fact, be on a little bit of a path toward a breakthrough. Prior to the pandemic, we were watching brands playing around with robotics. Anyone who travels was seeing robots working in airports. There were robot bars and restaurants. There were investments being made on the supply chain side, logistics, warehousing, delivery, et cetera. But a lot of it was experimental. And part of the reason that robotics was an experimental track for a lot of companies was that consumer sentiment around the use of robots was kind of iffy. Consumers felt a little weird around robots, and certainly they felt like if robots were displacing people and taking away jobs, that was something that they were not in favor of. And so you saw this sort of very trepidatious investments going on in robotics. I think that's going to change, and it's going to change because we're going to see consumer permission for robots now. I think consumers have been appalled in some cases to see human beings on the front lines of retail making minimum wage in many cases and putting their lives on the line to be serving customers or working in warehouses. And so I think consumers are going to open up to the idea that where it is safer to use a robot, or where it's more efficient or effective, or where the job would be so low paying that it would that it would be almost detrimental to a human being to do, then I think we're going to see more and more robotics being moved into the retail sector on both the back end and the front end. My hope, and this is really a hope, is that where we may wind up with fewer human people working in the retail industry, my hope is that those jobs will pay better, that the true value of a human, the dynamism that a human being brings to the relationship between a consumer and themselves, that can be rewarded with higher wages. So perhaps fewer people, better paid, more responsibility, higher skill levels, and a lot of the frontline, dangerous in some cases, grunt work going to robotics.
So to follow up with that, this is a question that we've received a lot of, and it's a little bit more tactical, but maybe you can talk us through perhaps the psychological aspect from a consumer standpoint. There's obviously going to be a shift in our comfort levels with returning to stores. And then on top of that, there's also going to be a shift in our comfort levels using things like touch screens in stores, which really have been the focus for a lot of retailers over the last 5 years, 10 years, to implement some of this technology into their stores to allow people to touch and to get more information. do you see that having a long-term effect on consumer behavior, or what's your feeling on touch screens and digital screens and things like that at retail?
Yeah, it's a good question. It would have made a great poll question, actually. But I mean, I would just throw this out to I'll throw this out to anyone out there listening who has parents that grew up during the recession. And I'm willing to bet, because mine did too, I am willing to bet that there were noticeable and persistent attitudes and behaviors on the part of your parents that were formed during the Great Depression. In my case, my parents would never throw anything away. I mean, they literally never threw anything away. Everything in our house was like 30 or 40 years old. My father fixed everything. Clothing got mended, money got saved, coupons got clipped, and it was all because of this incredibly traumatic and prolonged impact of the Great Depression. I would challenge this audience with the same question. How many of us, having lived through this, will ever look at a payment terminal, a touch screen, a bank machine the same way? I mean, we may get to a point where we say, okay, I'm inoculated, I'm vaccinated, but will we ever look at those buttons the same way? And so, yeah, I think that we're going to have to mitigate that. Retailers would be smart to be investing right now in alternate forms of payment, alternate forms of consumers receiving information, whether it's through gesture recognition, facial recognition, voice recognition. But this notion of touching things in a crowded retail environment, I think that is going to be a persistent underlying sort of subconscious thought.
So with that, I'm going to pivot slightly. I'm going to take us to our second poll. So we encourage everyone again to share your thoughts with us. And this poll is going to ask the question, to what degree do you or your organization feel it necessary to rethink your supply chain in light of the events and this, the impact of COVID-19 in your business? And again, while everyone takes 30 seconds, 45 seconds to answer this, I have a bit of a follow-up question for you, Doug, which is, can you tell us about the consumer mindset during crises like this? This has been a question that's continuously come up in our feed today. What should retailers expect about where consumers are at during and after the pandemic?
Yeah, good question. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we see in front of us today is fairly obvious, right? That consumers are worried, they're concerned for their health, they're concerned for their finances. And so, a lot of the conversation right now in the retail industry is around how are we going to reopen? And if we reopen successfully, consumers will come and they'll likely spend. I mean, I even hear really important players in the retail industry and really senior economists in some cases saying, hey, as soon as we get through this, everything will bounce back to normal. What I've discovered through my research is that it's not that simple, which will probably come as no surprise to anyone. But consumer psychology just simply isn't that simple. And then when you add sort of the accelerant of a crisis, it becomes even more complex. But I came across one theory that I found fascinating because I was really interested to know, like, what is going through the minds of consumers during periods of crisis. And I came across a theory that was developed by three social scientists, one of them a psychologist named Sheldon Solomon, who is a professor in the United States. He and three colleagues came up with a theory called terror management theory. And what the underlying thesis of terror management theory is this: we as human beings are unique. We are unique in the sense that we evolved to a point where we became cognizant of the notion of mortality. That we became cognizant of the fact that when we die, we're dead, and that we could die at any time. Now, the problem with that is that if you lived every minute of your life feeling like, any minute I'm going to get wiped out or I could die, it would really be a horrible condition. You would live in a constant state of terror. So what Solomon and his colleagues determined through research was that what we do to insulate ourselves against that terror is we create a worldview. Because the other unique capability of human beings is our ability to rationalize. So we create a worldview that protects us against the idea of death. And what does that worldview consist of? Well, it's about, school and work and church and community and family, right? All of these concepts that I build around myself to sort of give me a distraction from my own impending mortality. And the other side of that is within that worldview, we also try and imbue ourselves with value. So it's not just that we're a member of our family, we're a valued member of our family. It's not just that we work for a company, our work is appreciated by the people that we work for. We're a pillar of the community in our churches and that sort of thing. So we create this worldview and we create our own value within it. Now that's all great, and that works about 99% of the time to distract us from death. But every now and then, something comes along and pokes a hole in that worldview. The 9/11 terrorist attacks did that. All of a sudden, everyone felt for a moment like we were all vulnerable, that we could all die at any moment. And so what Sheldon Solomon calls that is mortality salience. It's this idea that every now and then our mortality hits us right in the face. So what do we try to do in the face of that? Well, first of all, when we're attacked by a threat, there are three responses. It's either fight, flight, or immobility. And we see a lot of immobility. So in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19 really starting to spread around the world, what did we see? We saw consumers hunkering down, really not spending much money at all. Just sort of watching the news. We go into this state of immobility. Then what we do is once we emerge from immobility, we start to try and build back that worldview. So how do we do that? Well, in some cases, it's through panic buying. It's that we figure if we've got a more full cart filled with groceries than the person next to us, that we're somehow safer, that we've insulated ourselves against the threat. Over time, what we start to do is build back that worldview. We try to reestablish our roots with the community, reestablish our place in the workforce, reestablish our role in the family, and to try and create that sense of value again, that we have our own self-esteem within that worldview. And how do we build back self-esteem? Well, in some cases, it's through purchasing things, right? It's by treating the family to a vacation or buying that new car or getting that thing you wanted, gives you that sense of self-esteem. For other consumers, it's negative behaviors. It may be drug use, it may be alcohol use, but whatever it is, we are doing that in order to bring back a sense of self-esteem after we've had this episode of mortality salience. So this it's not like a tap that you turn on and off. Consumer behavior is awfully complex, but it's interesting to me that once you start to sort of predicate your whole notion around consumer psychology around this idea that we spend most of our lives trying to pretend that we're not going to die and that we have value in the world, it tells you a lot about what's going on inside consumers' heads.
Exceptionally profound, really. Okay, so
scary too.
It is a bit scary, actually. Makes you think. I'm going to share the results of poll 2 now before we move on to some more live questions. So it's evident, 42% say that they are going to have to completely rethink their supply chain, and 38% say somewhat. So very few people are looking at this as an opportunity to continue on business as usual, which I think is likely a very good thing, because there's no real going back from what I've gathered from today's chat so far to the old way of doing things. Now, we've got a couple tactical questions. This question showed up a couple of times from Shannon, David, and Liz. Thank you for asking this. Who is doing this well? So can you think of any brands in particular that have either pivoted to really address the concerns of their consumers during this time, or had an impact on the way that brand sentiment or the way that people are discussing a brand? Anyone that's doing it well, really.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, in the interest of trying to provide an example that that everyone can relate to who's joining us today, I think you only have to look at really the stark contrast between a brand like Nike, for example, and Adidas. I wrote another piece about this just sort of as very early on in the crisis when companies were starting to sort of roll out their positions on this pandemic and roll out their positions to consumers about how they were going to do business and that sort of thing. And sort of, I saw this sort of stark contrast develop. So Adidas, for example, sent a memo to all their employees, all their store employees, and this came directly from their CEO, and it essentially said, it would be easy for us to close, but we're not going to do that. We think that in order to keep your salaries coming to you, it's better that we stay open. This was an internal memo. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to maintain open stores. The memo leaked out to the media. The media ran with it. The following day, Adidas reversed course, and they then spent money on advertising to sort of try and clean up the mess. They said, oh, you know, we're going to close our stores in the interest of the health and safety of our customers and our employees, et cetera, et cetera. But the toothpaste was out of the tube by that point, right? The message had already gotten out to the market. When you contrast that with what Nike was doing, so, and I'm going to go back a couple years, Nike, going back as far as 3 years ago, was already really testing the boundaries of online. They were really pushing their online direct-to-consumer game, making huge investments. On the brick and mortar side, they were experimenting with novel concepts. So, you know, Nike by Melrose in Los Angeles, small store concept, very local. Nike House of Innovation, kind of the big flagship store concept, but all really trying to test the boundaries of experiential retail. As it turns out, not only did Nike go to the consumer with a consistent message that said, no, we're not going to open our stores. Just go home, be safe, play inside, you know, we'll look after you some other way. They had the ability, they had made the investment to accommodate a customer online. And they, you know, had made these investments in brick and mortar so that when we do get back to a position where brick and mortar is relevant once again, they're in a great position to lead. So to my mind, you have everything there. You have great communication in crisis. You have great leadership and vision of the future. You have investments being made in the right end of the market. And as a consequence, you have a retailer that has posted relatively strong results, even in the face of this crisis. I think they're a great test example.
Fantastic. Now, this is a question here from Cassandra Kelly, and she asks, many are saying commercial mortgages are on the brink of collapse. Thoughts on this and how it will affect digital natives with a few stores? So Peloton, Warby Parker, Bonobos, all of those direct digital native brands.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess I'll take that in two pieces. The first piece is, you know, we talked a lot in 2019 about the move of digitally native brands, direct-to-consumer brands, making investments in physical retail. And what was motivating them to do that? And part of what was motivating them to do that was the cost of customer acquisition through online channels, through digital channels. In one case, I think it was Outdoor Voices, for example, was spending so much on incremental customer acquisition through online media that the actual revenue and profit from each of those incremental customers wasn't even covering the cost of acquisition. So weirdly, physical retail became a more efficient and cheaper proposition for these brands from a customer acquisition point of view, and it also allowed them to maybe widen sort of the lens of who they were attracting to their brand. Obviously, that now is a problem because physical retail, for at least the short term, is going to be experiencing disruptions. The good news for many of those brands is that we're likely also to see a decrease in digital media costs. So we may get back to a point where it starts to make sense again for these brands to be reaching out, spending money online in order to acquire new customers. But we'll see. It's going to be a rough road for many of them, because we're also going to see VC money now wondering if there's a better place to be than retail. If I'm a venture capitalist, I'm looking at the health sector. I may be looking at essential services, grocery, et cetera. I may not be thinking about how people can buy more eyeglasses or running shoes online. Having said all of that, I think it's also important that there be a coordinated effort in the retail industry among landlords, property developers, property managers, the government, coming together to talk about this issue of rent forbearance, of mortgage interest forgiveness. Something has to happen in a coordinated way to put a safety net under the retail industry, because it's not an exaggeration to say that the job losses alone in the retail industry, bearing in mind it's the biggest employer in a lot of economies, the job loss alone could tilt the entire economy to a bad direction unless we take a coordinated effort and action to save the retail industry during this time.
Great. We've got a question that I think is probably top of mind for a lot of people right now, especially as it pertains to the long-term approach for brands and retailers to take. And that comes from Andrea George. And she asks, what's your view on sustainability playing through and via retail onto the high street post-pandemic? And really, I think this affects all retail, really. So what role will sustainability play?
Yeah, that's a great question, Andrea. And our experience with sustainability, I suppose, until very recently has been that it's sort of like number 3 on the list of consumer priorities, that consumers sort of say, well, I want great value, I want convenience, I want quality, and oh, and by the way, it'd be great if it's sustainable. There is a possibility that will change. Again, it goes into, will we go through this big rethink? Will COVID-19 sort of be the thing that proves to us once and for all that, literally if someone sneezes in China, someone in North America gets the virus, that we are that closely knit as a global community, that the actions of one party impact the actions of another. And I mean, if nothing else, my God, look at what's happened just during COVID-19 in terms of the environment, that we're seeing clear skies in Los Angeles, that we're seeing animals returning to the landscape that we haven't seen, in urban populations. So in some weird way, maybe this is bringing us closer to nature, to the natural world, and maybe we will have more, a higher priority level put on sustainability as a leading preference in terms of who we're doing business with. That would be my hope. My hope is that we don't just sort of carry on like nothing happened. There's a great teachable moment here about our consumption patterns, about humanity, and about the natural world. And we should really take all of that into consideration. I hope retailers lead the way in that regard too, and don't just leave it up to consumers.
I agree. And I think first of all, I just want to say to everyone submitting questions, we have a ton of questions coming through, and thank you all again so much for submitting. I'm going to have to ask a couple of questions that are more sort of overall. I'm interested to hear from you, Doug, in terms of the long-term effects of COVID-19. And what do you see as being the longer-term changes that COVID-19 could bring? We've touched on a few today, but do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trap that we can fall into with this crisis is to look at the superficial aspects of it, and to be fair, I mean, we're reading through the news headlines and industry headlines. We see a lot of the same stuff. Are consumers now more open to online shopping? Will the online landscape look different? Is this the end of the shopping center as we knew it? I mean, there's a lot of that stuff. But for me, and this is really where I want the positioning of this book to sit, is that there's they often say that if you look out at the ocean, the current that you see on the surface is much weaker than the current that is deeper down. And so I think we really have to start plumbing the depths of this crisis and asking questions like, What are the deeper changes that are going to take place in society? Will COVID-19 finally be the point at which companies say, you know what, maybe we don't have to have 3,000 people come to an office every day. Maybe our people were productive and happier working out of their houses. Maybe they can come in every so often. And if people aren't as reliant on traveling into offices, what does that do to cities? How does that change the complexion, both demographically and economically, of cities? And if the nature of cities changes, well, what does that mean for the retail in those cities? And if education changes, what does that mean for a city like Boston when all of a sudden 30 or 40% of students aren't living on campus? They're not even living in the city anymore. Education becomes remote. How do we communicate? Just the fact that we're sitting here today talking with over 400 of you, having a personal dialogue is remarkable. We couldn't have even done that 10 years ago. So I believe that retail is a reflection of how we live. I don't believe how we live is a reflection of retail. I think retail comes from how we live. And if our lives, how we work, how we educate, where we live, how we live, if that's fundamentally changed, then we can expect that retail will change in a big way too. And so my work right now is really aimed at trying to understand those super deep tectonic shifts that are taking place and what that's ultimately going to mean for a different looking retail landscape.
So with that, I've been doing some research too, and I've sort of, a lot of people have their theories on this being what they call sort of the dress rehearsal for what's to come in terms of more pandemics and more issues and moments in time like this. How can or should retailers begin planning in the future for, other crises like this?
Yeah, we heard that a lot, right? We've heard it from business leaders, from analysts, heads of state, even saying nobody could have predicted this. Nobody could have seen this coming. But in fact, that's not true. People like Bill Gates and others have been out there for, decades talking about the fact that there will be another pandemic, that it's probably just around the corner. And when it hits us, it could be significant and severe. So we have known about these things. The problem is we don't allocate a tremendous amount of intellect or effort to understanding these things until they are a clear and present danger and they're right in our face. But I'll give you an example. Intel, I was talking with an expert in crisis management. I was asking him, like, who does crisis management really well? And he mentioned Intel. And he said, Intel has had a standing committee on pandemics for years. They just have this committee that gets together periodically, checks in on the whole idea of, could there be a pandemic? What are we going to do if there is one? What's our response? How are we going to do business? So a company like Intel has been prepared for this for years. There's no reason why business leaders shouldn't be doing the same sort of thing, putting together groups of executives whose job it is to focus on one point on the horizon and see if that object on the horizon is coming closer to them, and be prepared when it happens. The other thing is, one of the questions, Reilly, and you of course know this, one of the questions we ask all the time in workshops when we're doing strategic workshops with companies is, what would you sell if you couldn't sell what you sell? What would you do as an alternative if your core product or your core distribution method was taken out of commission? How could you pivot? Example being Airbnb. Obviously, Airbnb, for all intents and purposes, is out of commission, but they have pivoted now very quickly to delivering online experiences. It may not fill the gap. It may not become a long-term permanent business model, but it's something, right? It's a pivot, and it was probably something in their back pocket. So planning those contingencies, going through scenario planning, asking those really terrifying questions. What if our core product were, null and void? What would we do? And some of that is sort of exploring the big idea around your brand, that Nike is not just about a running shoe. Louis Vuitton is not just about a handbag. These are bigger ideas encapsulated within a brand. And within that, you've got a lot of different things that you can deliver to consumers that will have value, and it gives you these contingency plans. So I think it's a matter of leadership, it's a matter of vision, and it's a matter of confronting the horrible, ugly things that are sort of under the bed at night and dealing with them.
Mm. So we've got about 5 minutes till the end. Before we conclude,
that sounds oddly ominous. You mean the end of the live stream, right?
I mean, at this rate, 2020, I'm not sure. It
Yeah.
could be. So before we conclude, I want to just conduct one more poll for everyone who's still with us. Now, the question here, which you will see on your screens shortly, is: during or after the pandemic, do you and or your organization plan on investing more in digital? So I'll give you a couple seconds here. There's a lot of options for your responses here, so we can get nice and granular in terms of what your feelings on this are. And while everyone does that poll, Doug, are there any words of encouragement that you can share? I know that oftentimes with these, speaking of ominous, it can be overwhelming. It can feel ominous. We're still very much in this, and the light at the end of the tunnel seems like we're starting to see it. But I know for a lot of companies and brands, big and small, they're really still feeling the pressure of this and questioning a lot. So are there any words of encouragement that you can give the industry in these times?
So, look, guys, as we've said, there's no way to candy coat this. I think that, getting through this health crisis is going to be emotionally difficult. We're going to be dealing with a lot of mortality, a lot of loss of life. Eventually, that will probably be a few degrees away from each of us. So there's that. And then there is the economic turmoil that's going to come. But I want to share a story with you, just a really quick little story that I came across as I was sort of researching the 1918 pandemic. And just to sort of set the stage, understand that the 1918 pandemic, from a mortality standpoint, was far and away more lethal than what we're dealing with today. There were literally millions of people just in the US alone that perished in the 1918 pandemic. And the impact on the economy was very dramatic too, because of course there was no alternate, there was no internet, there was nothing else to do except physical retail and physical services. One of the categories that got brutalized the worst through that pandemic was the movie theaters. About 97% of movie theaters in the US closed down, just shut down. And they were largely owned by independent film houses. Owners of these film houses would show whatever movies they wanted to show their audiences. And so you had this situation where you had a lot of independents running these film houses, movies basically out of commission. Even the ones that were open, nobody was going to. I mean, and that's something that we've even seen in China more recently. But the movie theater industry was in ruins. Let's just put it that way. Enter a guy named Adolf Zucker. And Adolf Zucker was a Hungarian immigrant to the United States. He immigrated to New York City. He worked as a laborer for a while. Eventually, he got involved in the fur business. He became a designer of fur garments. He started his own chain of fur stores. And eventually, he made an investment in the movie business. Now, this is pre-pandemic, around 1906, I think. Made an investment in the movie business and sort of got involved in the entertainment and movie production business. Around 1912, he actually created Famous Players, which a lot of you will be familiar with, and then he went on to create Paramount Pictures. So Famous Players was the movie production house. Paramount was the distribution arm that would sell those movies into theaters. And around the time of the pandemic, Zucker realized something. With all of these theaters going out of business, he realized that if he acquired them, he would develop a completely vertically integrated industry where he would then own everything from the production of the movie itself through the distribution and then ultimately the exhibition of the movie. He controlled the point of distribution. which he did. He bought about 135 chains of movie stores around the US and basically created what we have today. The modern movie industry was created in the heart of the worst pandemic in history. Now, the moral of the story is you have a choice. You can either be the one that is saying, the movies are going out of business, the world is falling apart, we need to stop doing everything and just go into our shell, or you can be the Adolf Zucker. You can be the one who's scanning the landscape to find those opportunities, to move further ahead, to create a new business model entirely by capitalizing on the chaos. And that's really what this is a matter of. So my advice to you is be the Adolf Zucker in your category. And the other thing, just finally, I'd like to say is, you know, people have said, well, COVID-19 is like an accelerator. It's like a time machine into the future. It's going to propel us, you know, forward with all kinds of progress. I don't necessarily look at it that way because I think that there will be some negative things too. I think we're going to see more people falling back into poverty. We've spent the last several decades lifting people out of poverty. I think we'll see more people going back into poverty. I think that this is going to be very difficult socially and economically. So I don't think it's all going to be positive. But what I do think it is that COVID-19 is sort of a wormhole in space that I think once and for all may propel us out of the industrial world. Because let's face it, the retail we see around us today, most of it is a product of the industrial world. It is not a product of the digital world. So COVID-19 could be the wormhole that allows us once and for all to cross over into the digital age. And there's going to be vast amounts of opportunity once we make that leap.
Absolutely. So with that, only 2 minutes behind schedule. It's pretty impressive if you ask me. I'll share the results of our last poll, which show that obviously significantly people are planning on investing significantly more into digital given the pandemic and the implications of the pandemic. And with that, we've concluded today's live stream. I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. If you've enjoyed today's live stream, I wanted to call attention to the fact that we do have 6 new talks on the Retail Profit website delivered by Doug, and those are available for private live presentations. They're available for organizations to book. So if you're interested in that, there's information on that on our website. So you can visit us at retailprofit.com. I will also include the link in a follow-up email. And as I mentioned many times throughout this hour that we've spent together, I know we couldn't get through nearly all of the questions that were given. A lot of them were exceptional questions. So thank you all so much for your contributions. We will be following up with more information on webinars that are to come. So we're going to be doing more of these. So we'll be taking some of those questions that were left unanswered and bringing them to the next webinar in hopes to answer all of your questions. And thank you so much again. Have an amazing rest of your day wherever you are, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, everyone. Take care of yourselves.